So here we are in part 2 of our hockey mask project. So the first thing I'll do is just tidy up my item list. I'm going to select all of my fusion parts and I'll press Control G and that just groups them. And I'm going to name this GRP for group underscore fusion underscore parts, like so. And then I'm going to create a new mesh item, so N for new mesh item, and I'm going to call this head underscore form. Now, I'm going to use the mask main geometry as the start for my head form. So I'll come over to the group fusion parts and I'll click on mask main and I'll make it visible. 3 for polygons mode. I'll double click these polygons, Control C to copy those. I'll close this up and make it invisible. And then in my new head form mesh item, Control V to paste that. And then I might just press R to scale this inward just a little tiny bit. 98.5 is pretty good. Okay, now the idea is I want to just extend the back of this head a little bit just to give it a little bit more of a cranium because we're going to derive our straps from this mesh right here. So I just want it to resemble a little bit more of a human head. We're not going to bother with this underside here, which would be where the neck would go, and we would have to get rid of all of this area. So we'll just skip that. So I'll press T for the element move tool, and then I'll make sure symmetry is on. And then I'll right click in the viewport to change the influence of this element move tool. And now I'm just going to move this back a little bit. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, but it would be nice if it was just a little tiny bit better. So just bear with me as I adjust this. And if it's not perfect, I'm not going to worry too much about it. Again, once we have the curve down, we can just change the curve after the fact. So this isn't 100% necessary. This will just help me a little bit with the form. And obviously you can put a lot of time into this, but not totally necessary. Okay, I think I'm going to call it almost. I'm going to call it done in a second. So the element move tool is almost like sculpting right on your mesh. Whoops. Okay, now he has a little bit too much of a bump there, which we don't want. And if I go any further, this will just take too much time. So we'll call that done. There we go, that's it. So now I'm going to create a new mesh item, N for new mesh item, and I'll call this CRV for curve, strap underscore side. So this is going to be our side curve. Now I'm going to use the mesh constraints to apply this curve to this mesh, and one thing that we might want to do is duplicate this mask and delete all of these faces, all of these polygons that are on the inside, because if I leave them here and I go to constrain my curve to this head form, the curve is going to want to stick to these inside polygons. So let me just duplicate this really quickly. So Control C to copy, N for new mesh item. I'll just drag this underneath the head form. Control V to paste. I'll make the fusion output mask mesh item invisible, and I'm just going to rename this mask underscore temp for temporary. And I'm going to select these internal or these inside polygons. So 3 for polygons mode. I'm going to come over to the lists tab, and in polygons, let me just deselect my polygons. But in the polygons statistics section, I will come over to part, and where it says mask hollow, I'll just click the plus button. And then I can also click on the nose hollow, so plus for that to select those polygons. I can try clicking the plus next to side splitter, like so. Now if I press shift up arrow to expand the selection, we have a pretty good selection of polygons. I can even press Shift up arrow one more time. So Control X to cut, and now we have no internal polygons. So the constraint will have, when I have constraint mode turned on, nothing will be constrained to these back faces. So now I'll turn the head form back on, and we'll start creating the strap curves. So I'm going to turn symmetry off, and I'll just adjust my lists tab and then move over to the properties tab. And then I want to make sure my curve is going to be in this curve strap side mesh item, which is empty at the moment. And then I also want to disable my grid and work plane. So Control 1 to bring up my main pie menu, and I'll choose the bottom option, toggle grid work plane. And now I'm going to come over to the basic side tab, and I'll click on this button right here, which is the pen or polygon creation tool. And I'm just going to make sure I'm on B-spline. So by left mouse button clicking and holding on this button, you can choose all these different curves. So I'll choose B-spline curve. And then before I can start clicking, I'm going to turn on constraint mode. So where it says snapping right here, if you hold Control, the snapping button turns to constraint. So I'll click on that, and this gives us our mesh constraint options. I'll click background, and I want the geometry constraint mode to be vector. So there we go. Now as I start clicking to create my B-spline curve, it's going to be constrained, or it's going to adhere to the underlying background meshes. In this case, the hockey mask and our head form. So I'm just going to create this curve, and I'm putting a point basically wherever there's an edge. You don't have to do this, but this is just how I'm deciding to space this out, like so. And then when I get to here, I'm going to add one on the head curve. I'll add one on the beginning of the mask. I'll create one in the center of this circular hole, and then I'll add another point here. And we can always adjust this after the fact. Everything is editable afterwards. I'm still not happy with the shape of this head. I think it's a little bit too flat now. But again, this is something that we can totally correct, so we'll address that in a bit. So Q to drop the tool. If I select this curve, it's re-editable, which is nice. So I can adjust the points. But I think that's good for now. Now for the top curve, I can do the same thing. I can just press N for a new mesh item. I can rename this CRV underscore strap underscore top. But I'm not going to use that method. I'll use a different method. So I'm going to come over to the head form, and I'll press 2, and I'll select these edges, like so. And maybe I'll select this edge as well, and maybe this edge. And I'm actually going to make this procedural temporarily. So I'll turn off the mesh constraints, so I'll choose none, and then I'll close this little mesh constraint panel by clicking the circle. And I'm going to navigate over to my mesh operations tab, which is next to the items list. Now in the add operator button, I'll click that, and I'll choose edges to curves, and I'll double click that mesh op. Now at the moment, our curve type is set to polyline. I'll just change that to B-spline curve, and that's all we really need. So I'll select that curve and Control C to copy, and then I'm going to paste it into our new CRV underscore strap top. So Control V to paste, and then I can go back to this head form, which is still procedural, and I can just delete this mesh operation. So I'll delete that, and now it's a standard mesh item again. So back to items list. And now I can press 3 to go into polygons mode, make sure I'm inside my curve strap top mesh item, and from a right viewport we can start adjusting this. So it's just two ways to create a curve. Both are totally valid. And Control Spacebar, go back to perspective view. Now I might want to turn constrain mode on and just add a little bit more, some more points to this curve. So I'll do that. I'm going to come over to the snapping button. I'll hold Control to turn that into the constraint button, and then I'll turn on background constraint, with a geometry constraint of vector. And I want to make sure my B-spline tool is in add mode and not edit. So I'll change that to add. And now I can add polygons. And they're going to constrain nicely to the underlying geometry. So this is looking good. This is fine. I'll move this one back and I'll add a new one here. So there we go. That's looking okay. Now I'm going to move this curve down a little bit. Oops, maybe not that far down. And then I'll add another point here. And for now, that's pretty good. So now if I make my head form invisible, you can see our two curves, the top curve and the side curve, which goes around the head. So I'll turn my mesh constraint off and I'll close this. And what I might do is hold Control and select both the curves. And then if I press W for move, I can move both of these simultaneously, but I'm going to go to a right view, so Control Spacebar for my Views pie menu, and I'll choose a right view. And then I'm going to turn on a linear fall off, so linear. And I want this to be in the Z axis, like so. And I'll actually make this a little bit, I'll make the fall off a little bit tighter. And now when I move this, it's just going to move the back part. So that's pretty good. So escape. If I hold Control 1 and bring up my main pie menu, I can toggle the verts so we can see the vertices that make up these curves. I can press T for the element move tool, and then I can just move these just to kind of readjust them slightly. So that's looking good to me. Now I could just select these vertices in the side, and I could press R for the scale tool, and I have negative scale disabled, so now when I scale this down, they will be perfectly aligned. And then again, I can press W for move, and with the linear fall off set to Z, I can just move these back a little bit so they overlap with the back strap. So escape to drop the fall off, Control Spacebar, go back to a perspective view, and I think that's looking pretty good. Again, we can always adjust this. Now I don't want to see the vertices anymore, so Control 1, and I'll choose Toggle Verts. So now we're going to work on the actual profile of the strap. And before I create the profile, I'm just going to delete this temporary mask because we no longer need it. So I'll select it, and then I'll click this little X to delete it, and I'll make the our final mask visible again. So I'm going to create the profile for these straps, and it's just going to be a rectangular polygon. So I'll press N for a new mesh item, and I'll name this strap underscore profile. And it's empty at the moment, so I'm going to add a unit cube. So I'll hold Control and click on the cube icon. Again, I'll press 3 to go into polygons mode. I'll select this front polygon, open square bracket to select the inverse, Control X to cut it away, and then with this polygon selected, I'll press W for move, and I can just move it into Z, or I can come over to center selected and just center selected on all. So R for the scale tool, and I'll just scale this in the Y and X axis, and then I'll just scale it down in the Y. Now when you get to small increments in the scale tool properties, it gets a little bit less sensitive. So to reset that, you can just press R to drop the scale tool, and then R to re-enable the scale tool. And then the scale handles behave a little bit more, the handles are a little bit more gradual as you move them. So let me just look at that. That looks like a pretty good size. Again, we're going to do this procedurally, so we can always come back to this shape and change it. So Q to drop the tool, 2 to go into edges mode. I'll select this top edge, Alt C to add a loop slice. I want the mode to be symmetry, and I want the count to be 2. And then we'll just left mouse button click and drag in the viewport, and I want this to be about 1%. So Q to drop the tool, 2 to go into edges mode. I'll select this edge, Alt C again to add a loop slice, and this time I'll use the little handles up here to kind of get about maybe 95 or 96%. I think 95.5 looks good, so Q to drop the tool. Again, I'll select one edge here, Alt-C to again add a loop slice, but this time I want the mode to be uniform with a count of, let's try 5. That looks pretty good. 2 to go into edges mode, I'll select this edge, Alt-C, and this time our loop slice will be a count of 1 with a uniform mode. So Q to drop the tool, Shift-Tab to go into Catmull-Clark sub-D mode, and that is our strip or our strap profile. So now I'm going to add the strap as the source in a mesh op called the Merge Meshes mesh op, and then I'm going to extrude this profile along this curve. So it's easier to show than to actually explain. So I'll press N for new mesh item, and I'm just going to name this PRO for procedural underscore side underscore strap. And we'll make another one for the top strap. But this is a procedural mesh item, or it's going to be. So I'll come over to the Mesh Ops tab, and I'm just going to add an operator, and we'll add that Merge Meshes mesh op. If I expand the Merge Meshes mesh op by clicking the little triangle here and click on the sources, we can add a source. So I'm going to choose my strap profile. So here it is. And now we no longer need to see the original strap profile, so I'll make that invisible. Now on top of this Merge Meshes mesh op, I'll just add another operator. We'll use a curve extrude, and it's going to ask me for a path. So I'm going to choose my curve strap side. And then when I click OK, you can see this is what we get. Now I have to say, if you have access to the Poly Strips from Curves plugin from Mario Baldi, this would be incredibly easy. But since we're just using vanilla Modo for this tutorial, I'll just show you how to do it this way. And it's still easy. It's a matter of doing it in minutes versus a matter of doing this in seconds. But this is a great plugin. I highly recommend it. So in the Curve Extrude mesh op, I'm going to come over to the properties, and I'll make sure the selection type is polygon, and that will clean up some of that mess that we had there. And then I'm going to make sure the angle is not 0 degrees, but 90 degrees. And if you don't see that, your profile attributes properties might be not exposed. So just click on this little arrow, and now we can get to the angle, and we want it to be 90 degrees. And that's looking a little bit better. Okay, so now I can expand the Curve Extrude sub operations, and in the tool pipe, I can come over to Path Segment Generator, and the steps right now is set to 24. If I increase that to 48, it will just give us some more resolution along the curve. But I might even want to increase that to 64. And again, we can come back and adjust that all we want. So for now, that's okay. I might come back and add some more points to our underlying curve. But for now, let's work on the top strap. So I'm going to press N for a new mesh item, and I'm going to name this Pro for procedural underscore top underscore strap. And then we're going to do exactly what we did for the side strap. So I'll come over to Add Operator. We'll choose Merge Meshes. I'm going to expose the Merge Meshes sub operation so we can get to the source. And then I'm going to add the curve strap top. And it didn't ask me, oh no, that's fine. So now that is our, oh, we didn't want the curve strap top, we wanted the profile. So that's a mistake. If you ever do that, you don't have to delete it. You can just click this little left and right arrow, and that's the switch or swap icon. So by clicking that, I can now choose the profile. So let me just type in profile, and here it is, strap profile. And then here's the copy that we just made. And then above the Merge Meshes mesh op, I'm going to add the Curve Extrude. And this Curve Extrude is going to ask us for a path. And we'll choose the curve strap top. There we go. And again, it's a mess right here, but that's because we have to change the selection type from edge to polygon. So that's a start. And we don't have to mess with the angle this time, but I can expand the Curve Extrude sub-operations to get to the path segment generator, and we can make the steps 48, or maybe it's better that we match the side strap and we set this to 64. It's a little bit dense, but if we decide to sculpt on this afterwards, it'll be really nice to have that extra resolution. And again, because we used the merge meshes mesh op, if I return to the items list and click on the strap profile and make that visible, if I select this in polygons mode and press R, I can scale this in the Y, and our straps will decrease in thickness. So that's really, really nice. So I'm going to adjust these straps so that they don't interpenetrate with our hockey mask geometry. So I'm going to come over to the curve strap side, and I'll press 3 to go into polygons mode, and I'll select the B-spline curve. And now I'm just going to adjust this so that it's no longer overlapping. And I might need to add a little bit more, some more points. That's definitely a possibility. But if I can get away with it, I won't. So that looks pretty good. So I can live with that. I might want to just push this in a little bit. So that's fine. And then we're going to have a bolt that goes on top of that. So that all looks good. So I'll just adjust these. And I know this might be tedious to watch, but I don't want to leave anything out. I kind of wanted to resist doing a time lapse for this video, just so nothing went under anyone's radar. So I'll just move this up a little bit. And maybe I'll just move each of these points out. And that's looking pretty good in my book. Okay, so now let's move on to the top curve. So I'll click on the curve strap top and press 3 for polygons mode. I'll select the curve, and we'll just start adjusting this. So that's looking okay. And we'll move on to the back. Now the back here, I might want to add one more point, but we'll see. And if you notice that happen where it flips, there's a couple options. You can just keep editing it, and it will eventually, it will kind of revert back to what it was. Or if it's not doing that, you can come over to the procedural top strap, and in the mesh operations tab, come down to the curve extrude and just click on invert polygons. And there you go. But I'm actually not going to do that because I'm pretty sure I can get it to return to the way it was. So I'll come back to the curve strap top and 3 for polygons mode, select this curve. Now I'm going to come over to the B-spline mode, and I'm going to change from edit to add, and I might just add a point right here, and then move that up a little bit. And as I mentioned, if I can't get this to invert naturally, I will come over to the curve extrude mesh op and just fix it. So that looks pretty good. Now I might move these points inwards, and I'll do this from a right view. So Control spacebar, I'll choose right, and I'll just adjust these points. Okay, so that's good enough. This is almost looking like a VR headset strap. Okay, there we go. Control spacebar, I'll choose perspective. Q to drop the tool, and that's looking not too bad. So I'll just make my original strap invisible, the strap profile, and we'll start working on the bolt. I think it might be a good idea to create the bolt in a new scene. So I'll press Control N to create a new scene, and then I'll come over to the items list, and I'll drag this empty mesh item beneath the directional light, and I'll name this bolt underscore main. And in this empty mesh item, I'm going to come over to the basic side tab, and holding control, I'll click on the cube to create a unit cube. And then I'm going to make sure I'm in polygons mode. I'll press Shift D to subdivide the polygons. I want to make sure the subdivision method is Catmull Clark. I'll click OK. And I want to do this again. So Shift D and I'll click OK. Now I'm just going to delete half of this sphere. So I'll select these two polygons, L for loop, and then holding Shift and Control, I'll double click the bottom part, and that just selects everything on that side. So Control X to cut that away. And I want this bottom part to be a little bit more round. So 2 for edges mode, I'll double click this edge to select the edge loop. And then in the deform side tab, I'll choose radial, and I'll right click in the viewport. That just makes it a little bit more circular. So P for polygon, that closes that up. 3 for polygons mode, and I'll click this polygon. B for bevel, and I'm going to grab the red handle to inset this bevel to about here. And then I'll hold Shift and left mouse button click in the viewport to reinitiate the bevel tool, and I'll grab the blue handle this time to shift this bevel down. And then I'll hold Shift and left mouse button click in the viewport again to reinitiate the bevel tool, and this time I'll inset this by grabbing the red handle and dragging that inwards. And then Control X to cut that polygon away. Now I want to close this up, but I want to do it with all quads. So I'll press 2 to go into edges mode. I'll select this edge, and then holding Shift, I'll right click on this edge to select the 2 edges in between, and then again holding Shift, I'll click on this edge, and then still holding Shift, I'll right click on this edge to select in between. I'll come over to the edges or edge side tab, and I'll click bridge, and then I'll left mouse button click in the viewport, and now we have that nice and closed up with all quads. Now this part is optional, but it's something that I like to do. I'll press 3 to go into polygons mode and select these polygons, and then I'll press Shift S just to smooth this, and it just brings it inwards a little bit. So Q to drop the tool, Escape to drop the selection, and then 2 to go into edges mode, and I'm going to select this edge, Alt C, and I'll just add a count of 2 for this loop slice, and the mode is set to uniform. That's fine. So now Q to drop the tool. If I press Shift Tab to get into Catmull Clark sub-D mode, you can see that our bolt is a little bit soft, so I'm going to add some bevels, edge bevels, to these edges. So Shift Tab to get back to standard polygons mode, B for bevel. I'll just grab the blue handle and bevel this out. You'll notice that my edge shape is set to square. If it's set to round, you'll get this sort of effect, but I'll just keep that at square. And then we'll make that pretty narrow, maybe about 18 millimeters. So Q to drop the tool, I'll click in the viewport, Shift Tab, and that's looking pretty good. Now I'm debating whether I want to flatten the top a little bit. Let me just grab these polygons, W for move. Oh, I definitely don't want that. Control Z, Shift up arrow to grow my selection, R for the scale tool. Let me just try scaling this in a little bit and moving it down just to flatten it just a little bit. And let me actually lasso select all of these polygons and just see what happens if I move that down. R for scale, and then I'll just scale this a little bit in the XZ plane. And I think I'm happy with that. So let's work on the slots for this bolt, because I want it to be kind of like a Phillips head bolt. So I'll make the bolt main invisible. I'll press N for new mesh item, and I'll rename this empty mesh item slot underscore A. And I'll come over to the basic tab. Holding control, I'll create another unit cube. 3 for polygons mode. I'll double click the cube, R for scale, and then I'm just going to scale this so that it's kind of rectangular. And I probably need to see my bolt main in order to size this correctly. So W for move, R for scale, and basically what we're doing is we're trying to create the fusion source mesh that will be used to subtract from this bolt body. So I think that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll make it a little bit taller. And that's good. I'm not going to go any further than that. Okay, so now let's add some geometry. So 2 to go into edges mode. I'll select this edge, Alt-C, and I'll just add a count of 5, and then Q to drop the tool. I'll select this edge, Alt-C to add a loop slice, and a count of 5 is good. Q to drop the tool. I'll select this edge, Alt-C, and this time I want a count of 1, like so. Okay, so Q to drop the tool. Now if I press Shift-Tab, this is a little bit too soft, so we're going to add some edge beveling, so Shift-Tab. In order to select the correct edges, I'm just going to select this edge, holding Shift, I'll right-click on this edge to select in between, L for loop, and then holding Shift, I'll select this edge, and still holding Shift, right-click on this edge, L for loop, and then I'll just hold Shift and double-click this edge. And we actually want to select the inverse of this, so open square bracket. That gives us all of the edge border edges, so B for bevel, and I'll just bevel that a little bit. 16 millimeters is perfect. Q to drop the tool. So now I'm going to make a new mesh item, so N for new mesh item. We'll call this slot B, slot underscore B, and then I'm going to copy the polygons from slot A, Control C, and then I'll paste them in slot B, so Control V. E for rotate, and then holding Control, I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees in the Y-axis, and Q to drop the tool. Now I'm going to come back to this slot section in a minute. Let me just turn the bolt into a fusion item. So I'll hide the slot A and B geometry. I'm going to select my bolt main mesh, and then Control F to bring up my fusion pie menu, and I'll create a new fusion. I'll call this fuse underscore bolt, and then absolute strip width, that's fine. I'll just click new fusion with selected meshes, and now I want to make a whole new fusion item with these slot mesh items. So I'll hide the primary bolt main, and I'll hide the fusion item. And if I fuse this together, we might get some errors because there's overlapping or there's geometry that's sharing the same space. You'll see some Z fighting right here because they're overlapping. So I'm just going to make one of these a little bit taller. So 3 for polygons mode, R for scale, and then I'll just make one a little bit taller. And this is fine because we're going to trim this anyway. So Q to drop the scale tool, 5 to go into items mode. I'll select this item, Control F, and new fusion, and I'll just call this, I'm actually going to name this CT for compound trim, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, and then underscore slots, and then new fusion with selected meshes. Now I want this to add to this primary, so I'll click on this and drag it to here, and I'll choose fusion, apply primary. So now they're both being added together. And I'm actually going to click on slot A and slot B and drag that above CT slots. Now I'll press N for a new mesh item, and I want this to actually be a subtractive element. And rather than creating a new cube, I can just derive this new mesh item from an existing geometry. So 3 for polygons mode, I'll select this polygon. Holding Shift, I'll right-click this polygon, and that selects everything in between. Control C, and then I'll paste that into the new empty mesh item, Control V. E for rotate, and I'll just rotate this like so. R to scale, I'll just scale that. And from a sort of top view, we can just make these a little bit more square. That's fine. I might actually subdivide this one more time, so Shift D, and I'll choose faceted, and then I'll just move this down. And what I'm going to do with this, I'm actually going to make this kind of bow upwards. So with the move tool still active, I might turn on the radial fall off, and I might just move it up like so. And I'll press Shift Tab to go into Catmull-Clark sub D mode. And I want the shape preset to be ease in. So let me just actually undo that, and we'll do that again. So escape. I want to make sure I'm in Catmull-Clark sub D mode. I'll press W for move. I want a radial fall off, and I want to make sure the shape preset is ease in. And now when I move this up, we're getting a nice kind of bowing effect. It's very bulbous. Okay, so Q to drop the tool, escape to drop the fall off. I'm just going to scale this up a little bit, and I'll move this down slightly. Now another thing that I want to do is I want to copy this geometry. So Control C, and I'll paste it in the same mesh item, and then just bring it up. And I'll press F to flip the polygons. And now when I subtract this bottom and top piece, it will actually only keep what's in the center. So if I select this in items mode and then drag it onto our primary and choose apply subtraction, and then I do the same thing for this this other slot, slot A. So I'll select the mesh, drag it onto slot A, and choose trim. You can see that the combination of slot A and B are only existing in between this magenta wireframe mesh. So that's exactly what we want. So if I hold Control F and toggle the source visibility, you can see the kind of shape that we're getting. Now, let's talk about compound trims. So this is my second fusion item. Let me make my first fusion item visible. Here it is. So what a compound trim allows you to do is subtract one fusion item from another. So we're going to subtract this kind of cross piece from our bolt. So in order to do that, I'm going to select one of the fusion sources of the second fusion setup. So in this case, I'll choose slot A. I'll come over to the fusion side tab, and I'm going to choose the bottom left option, which is actually it's not that one, it's right here under compound trims. Convert current fusion item to a compound trim. So when I do that, we get this nice bounding box locator, and I'm going to drag that above the fuse bolt. And I'm also going to make the slot A invisible. So now if I make the bolt visible and I select the compound trim locator and I shift select the primary for the original fusion item, and then I choose set mesh roll and apply subtractive, it will subtract. I probably just need to move this locator down so we start to see the effect. So now we're starting to see the effect. Now if you notice any lag, it's because it's updating live. I can always come to the fusion item and turn on deferred updates. And by doing that, I can now select the locator for the compound trim and start moving this, and it will update only when I mouse up. And I prefer working this way, it just feels a little bit snappier. So now I just have to determine how deep I want to go with this. So I'll make the bolt main primary temporarily invisible, and I think I'll just go a little tiny bit deeper. And what's nice is we're getting this nice rounded base at the bottom of this Phillips bolt head. So that's about good for me. Q to drop the move tool. I'll hide the compound trim, and now I want to get access to the strips. At the moment, the fusion item has no children items or child items. So Control F to bring up my fusion pie menu, and I'll choose the leftmost option, which is create update strip items. And Modo thought about that for a second, but now I have access to the strips. So when I click on a strip, we get this fusion strips pop over. I'm just going to select all strips, and then I'm going to edit these all at once. So I'll make this probably about 8 millimeters. Maybe I'll make that 12 millimeters. That looks good. And we can even adjust the corners. So a corner is everywhere there's a junction or a junction between these strips. So I'll come over to the Fusion strips pop over, and where it says strip corners, I'll click adjust density to, and I'll change this to something like 5%. And if I choose the rightmost icon, this circular icon, you can see we get a very rounded corner. And if I choose the leftmost option, we get a very angular corner. And everything in between will be either angular or round, depending on what you choose. And it will also take into consideration your density percentage. So I have a low percentage, 5%, so it's going to give a little bit of an effect. So I'll choose the second from the left. It's a subtle effect, but it makes a huge difference when you actually output this to standard geometry. Okay, so that looks good to me. I'll come over to my Fusion item. I want to make sure my mesh mode is set to airtight final with parts. I'll close my Fusion strips pop over, and I'm just going to duplicate this into standard geometry. So I'll click dupe and convert to mesh, and I'll give this a name. We'll just call it bolt, and I'll click create mesh. And now in our item list we have the bolt item. So I'll just right click on this and edit the color and choose none, and I'll drag that beneath the Fusion item. And now I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup. So I'll press 3 for polygons mode, I'll go to my bolt item, and I'll come over to the mesh edit tab, and I'll run mesh cleanup. And I really only want one of these options enabled, and that is fix face normal vectors. So I'll click OK, and it says 1186 face normals fixed. I'm going to run that again because sometimes it doesn't catch everything, and luckily it seems to have worked this time. It says that it caught everything. Just to be safe, we'll do it one more time, and it is perfect. So I'm going to copy all of these polygons, Control C, and then I'll return to my hockey mask mesh item, or my hockey mask scene. I'll press N for new mesh item, and Control V to paste that bolt, and that's a big bolt, so we're going to shrink that. So R for scale. We'll just make it about that size, and then I'll rename this bolt. Now, because I'm extra careful, I'm just going to run another mesh cleanup on this. So Q to drop the scale tool. I'll come over to mesh edit, run a mesh cleanup, and 118 face normals fixed. And then I'm going to come over to the lists tab, and under other maps, I'm just going to clear my normals maps. That could just mess up shading. I've noticed that whenever I copy polygons from one scene to another, it's always a good idea just to clear your normals. Otherwise, you might get shading errors. So next, we'll place this bolt on the actual straps. Now, to place this bolt, we could use the mesh paint tool, which we used previously, but I think I would like to do a little bit of work in the schematic with replicators. So I'm going to come over to my item list, and I'll press N for a new mesh item. I'll drag this beneath the bolt, and I'll call this points. And I'm going to come over to the vertex tool, or the vertex tab, and I'm going to enable my vertex tool, and let's see, enable constraint mode. So where it says snapping, I'm going to hold control, and when it says constraint, I'll click on that, and I'm going to toggle the background constraint mode, and geometry constraint set to vector is fine. Now I want to see my vertices, so Control 1 to bring up the main pie menu, and I'll toggle verts, and I'm just going to create a point everywhere I want there to be a bolt. So right here, this is fine. I'll create one in the back. I want there to be one right around here, and it looks like it's not constraining. And I'll do one here. That one looks good, and I'll do one on the top. And I'm going to have to return to the back because for some reason that didn't seem to be working very well. So right here is perfect. Okay. So let me actually press 1 to go into vert mode, and I'll select this vert, W for move, and I'll just move this manually. There we go. Okay, so here it is. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it's there. If I lasso select, you can see we have 4 vertices total. And if I turn off my straps and my curves and the mask, you can see here are the 3 or the 4 verts, and then here is the bolt. So let me turn off background constraint, and I'll close this up. I'm going to bring my mask back, and I'll bring back the straps, and I'll toggle off the verts now. So Control 1, toggle verts. Now the problem is they look invisible now, so they're still there. We just have to keep that in mind. And now we're going to create a replicator, and we're going to replicate this bolt everywhere we have a vert. So at the moment, the workspace I'm in is the Fusion workspace. So if I click on this arrow to move up, I'm going to go back to my general workspace. I'm just going to clear this, so I'll select these nodes, and then I'm going to right click and remove them. And then I'm just going to bring in my bolt, and I'll bring in my points, so I'm just dragging them into the schematic. And I want to bring in a replicator, so I'll click Add, and I'll type in replicator, and I'll just double click that. So here's my replicator. The bolt will be the prototype, and the points will be the particle source. And now I can make my original bolt invisible. Now at the moment, the bolts are showing up as bounding boxes. If I press Control, or I'm sorry, if I just press O in the viewport, I can come over to replicators, and it says none. You can either choose selected, but because I don't have many replicators, I only have 4, I'm going to choose all. So now our bolts are showing up. And the trick now is going to be rotating them to look like they are sitting in the right area. This one looks okay. It could be rotated a little bit. Now the problem is these are replicas. It's not actual geometry, and that's why it's actually pretty light. If I try to if I select the replicator, if I go into polygons mode and try to select it, there's no actual polygons there. So I have to actually select the points, and points can't be rotated. So I have to actually create a specific type of map that allows me to rotate points. So I'm going to come over to particle maps, and I'll create a new map, and I want this to be a transform map. So I'll just leave the name transform, that's fine. So now if I select this map and press E for rotate, I can actually rotate this vertex. So I'll just rotate this into place. I can also move it. So that's good enough for me. Maybe I'll move it out a little bit just so there's no potential for interpenetrating geometry. So that looks good. I'll move on to the next point. So select this point, E for rotate, and I'll just rotate this. And it's pretty easy. W, and I'll just move this in. And it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. We can even rotate the bolt so that it doesn't look like it matches the other bolts. Okay, so that looks good to me. I'll just move that in a little bit. W for move, like so. We'll move on to the top one. And this one barely needs any work. E for rotate. I'll just rotate this like so. W to move, and we'll just move that in. And now we're left with the back bolt. So 1 for vertex mode, select that vert. E for rotate. And remember, the only reason we're able to rotate these verts is because of the map. And we're actually not rotating the vert because that's impossible. but the vertex has a normal, and we can tell Modo what direction we want that normal to face in. So there we go. That's looking okay. So I've demonstrated a variety of techniques in this tutorial, and there's definitely more that can be done. We can apply material groups, we can apply materials, we can set up a scene and do some lighting. I can add some damage to this. We can return to the fusion item and create some iterations, some different variations on this design. Maybe give him a shorter nose and larger eyes. I can run a dynamic simulation on the straps. There's a lot of things that we can do here, but for now I think this is enough information to get you guys started. So I would highly recommend creating your own mask and sharing your results on the forums. It's a great little project to get you familiar with a lot of tools in Modo, and Modo has so much to offer. So if you have any issues or if you're stuck at any point, please ask on the general section of the forums or the getting started section. I'm more than happy to help out, and I really can't wait to see what you guys create. So thanks for watching.